Hello, this is Group 2, and today we are going to discuss the Gaussian mixture model. Now, as we all know, if we look at the big picture, there are three main types of machine learning: supervised learning, unsupervised learning, and reinforced learning. And in unsupervised learning, you don't really know the true value, which is the y variable. So we need to discover the patterns and information on unlabeled data. And examples of these kinds of unsupervised machine learning are k-means clustering in the Gaussian mixture model, and the Gaussian mixtures model is our primary point of discussion in this presentation. But before we move on to the actual mixture model, we need to discuss the limitations of k-means clusterings, because we generally consider the Gaussian mixture model as the improvised, generalized version of the k-means clustering. So let's talk about the limitations of k-means clustering. There are two main limitations. First is the difficulty of assignment in cases of overlap. So there is no probability measured in these assignments. And the second is the difficulty of accounting for non-circular clusters. So let's discuss these points one by one. As seen in the k-means section in the previous presentation, if we have simple blobs of data, the k-means algorithm can quickly label those clusters in a way that closely resembles what we do visually. However, there are some instances where the k-means assignments of those points seem less clear than others. I'm talking about the areas where those blobs seem to overlap. Now, if we take a look at the picture on the right, there are sometimes multiple close clusters, such that we may not have complete confidence in the cluster assignment of the points between them. I'm specifically talking about the points inside the yellow circle in the picture. Now, the k-means model has no measure of probability or certainty of cluster assignments, which gives us a need to further generalize the model. Right now, if the picture is described in a way that makes us able to recognize which is labeled to which, because there are colors that are assigned to them. But if we imagine that there are no colors in the first place, it's going to be very difficult to immediately discern which area in those overlapped parts go to which circle. Furthermore, the k-means model places a circle at the center of each cluster, with a radius defined by the most distant point in the cluster. So as we take a look at the picture on the right, the k-means creates like a really firm circle, and there is a very hard cutoff for this cluster circular assignments within the training set. So, which means any point outside the circle is not considered a member of the cluster. And these cluster models have to be circular, and that can be a problem in some cases. So the k-means has no built-in way of accounting for oblong or elliptical clusters, as you can see on the right. This means that depending on the transformation of the data, the cluster assignments can end up becoming a bit muddled. And by eye, we recognize that these transformed clusters are non-circular, so we intuitively realize that the k-means cluster will be less effective for these kinds of data sets. So it's not flexible enough to account for these kinds of issues. And if we just keep using this method, we will be trying to force fit the data into our circular clusters. So these 2 points provide us with the need to further generalize the model and improvise it, which will be discussed in the next section.
So the next topic is generalizing EM Gaussian mixture models. GMM creates a mixture of multidimensional Gaussian probability distributions for a dataset. So what does this mean? Well, GMM clustering is actually very similar to KNN clustering, which we're familiar with. As you can see in the figure, GMM clustering is able to identify the points of data into 4 different clusters and assign them. However, GMM clustering is different from KNN clustering because it can also perform probabilistic cluster assignments. This means that it is able to create a matrix that is n samples by n clusters. And you can see this by the blue box, which identifies that there are 4 clusters assigned, and the green box, which identifies that there are 5 samples, and then recording the probability that any point belongs in a certain cluster. So as you can see, there is different numbers which indicate how likely the point is in that cluster. And this can be shown visually by showing the point size of the data point based on how certain the prediction is. So GMM and k-means use expectation and maximization to identify the clusters and assign points. What this means is they first choose a starting guess, location, and shape, and then they repeat it until the data is converged. So for the expectation part, each point is assigned different weight encoding of probability of membership within that cluster. And for maximization, each cluster updates the localization, normalization, and shape based on all data points. It also utilizes weights to do so. So let us visualize GMM shape and location of clusters. This can be done by using this code to draw an ellipse with a given position and covariance around the clusters that have been identified. So as you can see, it is able to identify that there is 4 different clusters and there is basically 3 different rings of data point, one being the closest to the center, then outward and outward further. GMM is also able to fit stretched data sets, as you can see. How is it able to do so? Well, we can do so by changing the covariance type. And the covariance type controls the degrees of freedom of the cluster shape. So in this instance, we see that covariance type is set to full, which means that each cluster is modeled after an ellipse. This process may be computationally intensive, but it allows us to fit this stretched data set. So what other types of covariance are there? Well, the default covariance type is diag, which sets the size of the cluster along each dimension independently. We also have covariance type spherical, in which all dimensions are equal, and we'll end up getting circles similar to what we saw and similar to k-means.
So the last concept we are going to talk about today is the Gaussian mixture model as density estimation. Though GMM is often categorized as a clustering algorithm, fundamentally is it an algorithm for density estimation. That is to say, the result of a GMM fit to some data is technically not a clustering model, but a generative probabilistic model describing the distribution of the data. As an example, consider some data generated, like the one from the right-hand side over here. If we try to fit this into a 2-component GMM, viewed it as a clustering model, the results are not particularly useful, like the one that we have down here. But if we instead use many more components and ignore the cluster label, we'll find a fit that is much closer to the input data. Here's a mixture of a 16 Gaussian servers, not to find separated cluster of data, but rather to model the overall distribution of the input data. This is a generated models of the distribution, meaning that the GMM gives us the recipe to generate new random data distributed similarly to our input. For example, here are 400 new points drawn from the 16-component GMM fit to our original data. GMM is convenient as a flexible means of modeling an arbitrary multidimensional distributions of data. So, how many components is needed for building a model? The fact that GMM is a generated models give us the natural meanings of determining the optimal number of components for a given data set. A generated model is inherently probability distributions for the data set, and so we can simply evaluate the likelihood of the data under the model using the cross-validation to avoid overfitting. Another means of correcting for overfitting is to adjust the model likelihood using some analytic criteria such as a K information criterions or Aldebaran information criterions. Skitler JMM estimator actually includes built-in models that compute both of these, so it is very easy to operate on this approach. When applying the AIC and BIC as a function as a number of JMM components by using the code right here, we have the graph as the visualization of AIC and BIC for choosing the number of component. The optimal numbers of cluster is the value that minimize the AIC or BIC, depending on which approximation we wish to use. The AIC tells us that our choice of 16 components was probably too many. Around 8 to 12 components would have been a better choice. As is typical with this sort of problem, the BIC recommends a simple model. Notice this important point. This choice of number of component measure how well JMM works as a density estimator, not how well it works as a clustering algorithm. I would encourage you to think of JMM primarily as a density estimator and use it for clustering only when guaranteed within simple data sets. That is it for our presentation. Thank you so much for listening.